February 11th, 1944, 2:17 p.m. Stalag 319, 14 kilometers west of Vitebsk, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Oberstleutnant Klaus Reinhardt stood at his office window, watching steam rise from his coffee cup and merge with his breath in the unheated room. Outside, 200 Soviet prisoners stood in formation in the compound yard, their thin prison uniforms offering no protection against the wind that cut across the Belarusian plain like a blade. The temperature was -18°C. They had been standing there for 43 minutes. Reinhardt was a linguistics professor before the war, specializing in Slavic languages at Heidelberg University. He spoke Russian better than most Russians, Polish fluently, and could navigate the regional dialects of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. This expertise had made him invaluable to Wehrmacht intelligence operations on the Eastern Front. It had also cursed him with understanding every word the prisoners whispered to each other when they thought no Germans were listening. He knew their names, their fears, their children's names, the villages they came from. The SS teletype message sat on his desk, still warm from the machine. He read it again, though he had already memorized every word. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. Immediate execution ordered. All partisan suspects currently held Stalag 319. No trials, no delays. Completion required before nightfall. SS inspection team arrives 0800 hours, 12th February. Graves must be ready for verification. Einsatzgruppe group of coordination available if requested. Heil Hitler. 6 hours. He had 6 hours to murder 200 men, or 6 hours to do something that would guarantee his own execution. The door behind him opened without knocking. Hauptmann Georg Seidel, his second in command, entered and saluted. Seidel was 26, a true believer who wore his SS liaison pin prominently and never questioned orders. The firing squad is assembled, Herr Oberstleutnant. Graves are being dug in the eastern sector, beyond the tree line. We can begin immediately. Reinhardt continued staring out the window. One of the prisoners in the yard had collapsed. 2 others were trying to help him stand, their movements sluggish from hypothermia. Dismiss the prisoners to their barracks, Reinhardt said quietly. Issue them extra rations. Bread, soup, whatever we have. Seidel's face showed confusion. Sir, the execution order. I'm aware of the order, Hauptmann. Reinhardt turned from the window. His face was expressionless, but something in his eyes made Seidel step back. I'm also aware that if we execute starving, frozen men, the bodies will show they died from exposure before any bullets reach them. The SS inspection team will notice. They'll question whether we followed procedure. This was a lie, but it was a lie that sounded like Germanic efficiency. Seidel considered it. We want healthy-looking corpses, Hauptmann. Men who clearly died from execution, not from our negligence. Feed them. Warm them. Then we'll proceed. Reinhardt returned to his desk. You're dismissed. After Seidel left, Reinhardt sat motionless for 5 full minutes. Then he picked up his telephone and made 3 calls. The first was to his supply officer. The second was to his chief engineer. The third was to Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, the one officer in the camp he trusted absolutely. Because Hoffmann had once, drunk on schnapps, confessed that he'd falsified a Jewish family's papers in Cologne and helped them escape to Switzerland. If you're enjoying this journey into one of World War II's most morally complex moments, please subscribe. These stories of impossible choices deserve to be remembered. The compound at Stalag 319 had been built around an abandoned mining operation from the 1920s. Soviet engineers had attempted to extract iron ore from the region, failed, and left behind a network of tunnels that descended 4 levels into the earth. The Wehrmacht had sealed the main entrance with concrete when establishing the camp, dismissing the mines as strategically worthless. Reinhardt had spent 3 months quietly researching the mining operation through local records and interviewing elderly Belarusians who remembered the Soviet construction. He knew something his superiors didn't. There were 3 additional access points, all hidden in the forest beyond the camp perimeter. At 3:45 p.m., Reinhardt gathered his inner circle in his office. Hoffmann, Hauptmann Seidel, Oberfeldwebel Ernst Vogel, the supply master, and Lieutenant Hans Bruckner, the camp engineer. He closed the door, locked it, and turned off the radio that usually played static to mass conversations. Gentlemen, Reinhardt began, his voice steady despite the insanity of what he was about to propose. We have an execution order that cannot be refused. We also have an SS inspection arriving in 15 hours. I am about to explain how we will satisfy both requirements while committing high treason. Seidel's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. Reinhardt noticed but continued calmly. Before you shoot me, Hauptmann, consider that if this were a legitimate order, Einsatzgruppe would handle it. They're specialists. The fact that this was dumped on us means someone at headquarters wants distance from this particular atrocity. They want Wehrmacht fingerprints on it, not SS ones, which means they're already covering their tracks, which means we're expendable. Vogel, the oldest man in the room at 53, spoke first. What are you proposing, sir? We fake the execution, stage it completely, use blank ammunition, theatrical blood, forged documentation, hide the prisoners underground in the mine system until Soviet forces overrun this position, which according to intelligence will happen within 8 to 12 weeks. Then the prisoners simply reappear as liberated POWs. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, a truck engine coughed in the cold. Bruckner, the engineer, leaned forward. The mine shafts are sealed. The main entrance is sealed, Reinhardt corrected. I know where the other 3 are. I need you to make them habitable without anyone noticing construction. How many witnesses to the execution? Hoffman asked quietly. Minimum necessary. The firing squad doesn't need to know they're firing blanks. We tell them the brass wanted visual confirmation of proper execution procedure for training purposes. So we're filming it. We use the camera to control the angle, ensure no one gets close enough to see there are no actual wounds. We stage it at dusk when light is poor. We transport the bodies immediately to the burial site, which is actually the mine entrance. The graves the SS will inspect tomorrow are filled with animal carcasses and enough human clothing to pass cursory examination. Seidel's face had gone pale. This is treason. This is murder if we follow the order. Reinhardt interrupted, his voice sharp now. I've read the Geneva Conventions. I know what we signed. These men are partisans, yes, but they surrendered under white flag after the Vitebsk encirclement. We accepted their surrender. We gave them prisoner status. Now we're ordered to execute them without trial because someone in Berlin decided it's more convenient than managing POWs during a retreat. He paused. I will not murder men who surrendered in good faith. I will not turn this camp into an extermination facility. And I will not allow any of you to become war criminals. We're already war criminals, Vogel said quietly. All of us, the whole Reich. We're just choosing which particular crime we'll be guilty of. Reinhardt nodded slowly. Then I choose the crime that lets me sleep at night. Who's with me? The 4 men looked at each other. Years later, Hoffman would describe this moment as the longest silence of his life. Each man calculating not just his own survival, but weighing something harder to measure. The distance between the soldier he'd become and the man he'd been before the war. Bruckner spoke first. I can make the mines habitable. I'll need 3 days and a work crew I can trust. You have 6 hours, Reinhardt replied. Then I'll need more than trust. I'll need miracles. We'll provide both, Reinhardt said. He turned to Vogel. How much pig blood can you obtain in 4 hours? Enough to fill a bathtub if I slaughter everything in the camp livestock pen. Do it. I also need 200 sets of prison clothes that we can destroy, 40 liters of kerosene, and enough quicklime to make shallow graves look properly treated. The SS will inspect the graves, Seidel warned. He still looked uncertain, caught between obedience and something that might have been conscience. If they dig, they won't dig. They'll see fresh earth, smell the rememe, verify the paperwork, and leave. The Eastern Front is collapsing. They're not going to waste time exhuming corpses when there are 50 other camps to inspect. Reinhardt pulled out a map of the compound. Here's how this works. For the next 20 minutes, he outlined a plan so audacious that even he privately admitted it had perhaps a 30% chance of success. They would execute the prisoners at 7:30 p.m. using blank rounds fitted with theatrical flash suppressors that Bruckner would manufacture. The prisoners would be briefed in Russian, himself to fall on command and remain motionless. Wehrmacht trucks with covered beds would transport the bodies to the burial site, which was actually the concealed northern mine entrance 3 kilometers from camp. The prisoners would enter the mines and remain there while the camp staged an elaborate burial ceremony with animal carcasses wrapped in prison uniforms. The SS inspection team would verify graves, review falsified execution logs, and depart satisfied. Meanwhile, 200 living men would occupy 4 levels of abandoned mine shafts, supplied through covert nighttime deliveries via the forest access points. Reinhardt would manage this alone, using his position as camp commander to authorize nighttime patrols that were actually supply runs. The Soviet offensive will reach us by mid-April, Reinhardt concluded. That's approximately 8 weeks. We can sustain 200 men underground for that period if we're disciplined about rationing. And if the Soviets don't arrive, Hoffman asked? If they're pushed back, if we hold this ground? Reinhardt met his eyes. Then I'll release the prisoners myself, walk to the nearest Soviet position, and surrender. But that won't happen. Army Group Center is finished. Vitebsk will fall. We're planning a general retreat westward by March at the latest. The question isn't whether we'll abandon this camp, but how many lives we can save before we do. Seidel stood abruptly. For a terrible moment, Reinhardt thought he was reaching for his weapon. Instead, Seidel saluted sharply. I'll prepare the firing squad, he said tonelessly. Blanks only, visual documentation for training purposes. He paused at the door. My father was a judge in Bremen. He taught me that law means nothing without conscience. I think he'd approve of this treason. After he left, Vogel exhaled slowly. We're all going to hang. Probably, Reinhardt agreed, but we'll hang for the right reasons. At 4:30 p.m., Reinhardt entered the prisoner barracks alone, carrying a kerosene lamp. The 200 men inside stood immediately, their faces showing the mixture of fear and defiance that captured partisans always wore. They knew execution was standard procedure. They'd been expecting it for weeks. Reinhardt set the lamp on a table and spoke in fluent Russian, his accent carrying the Petersburg refinement that marked him as an educated speaker. My name is Klaus Reinhardt. Before the war, I taught Russian literature at Heidelberg. I've read Tolstoy in the original. I've translated Pushkin. I mention this so you understand I'm not some Nazi thug pretending to speak your language. I speak it better than most of you. The prisoners exchanged glances. This was not how execution orders were typically delivered. You're scheduled to die tonight, Reinhardt continued, shot by firing squad at 7:30 p.m. This order came from Berlin, endorsed by the SS, and there's no official way to refuse it. He paused. I'm going to unofficially refuse it anyway. Here's what's going to happen instead. For the next 40 minutes, he explained the plan in detail. The prisoners listened in absolute silence. When he finished, a man in the back row spoke. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Komarov, a partisan commander who'd held Vitebsk's northern suburbs for 6 weeks before being overrun. Why, Komarov asked simply. Why risk this? Reinhardt considered the question carefully. Because I'm not a Nazi. I'm a German officer who made the mistake of thinking there was a difference. I've spent 3 years watching that distinction disappear. I can't stop the war. I can't fix what's broken in Berlin, but I can prevent one atrocity. So that's what I'm going to do. You'll be executed if they discover this, another prisoner said. Yes. Your family? I have no family. My wife died in the Hamburg bombing. My son was killed at Kursk. Reinhardt's voice remained steady. I have nothing left to lose except the ability to look at myself in a mirror. So here's the arrangement. You pretend to die, you hide underground, you survive. When the Red Army arrives, you tell them exactly what happened, that a Wehrmacht officer faked your execution and kept you alive. Maybe that testimony matters during whatever tribunal comes after. Maybe it doesn't. But either way, go home. And I get to believe there's still something human left in the unforsaken war. The prisoners debated among themselves in rapid Russian. Reinhardt understood every word. Some wanted to trust him, others suspected an elaborate trap. A few were fatalistic about dying regardless. Finally, Komarov raised his hand for silence. We agree. But if this is betrayal, if you're using us for some Nazi game, know that we'll die fighting. You understand? I understand, Reinhardt replied, and I'd expect nothing less. The staging of the execution was perhaps the most surreal military operation on the Eastern Front that night. At precisely 7:15 p.m., Lieutenant Hoffman assembled a firing squad of 12 men in the compound's eastern sector, where a long earthen berm created a natural backstop. A Wehrmacht camera crew, actually just Bruckner with an empty camera casing, set up position 20 meters away. Floodlights were arranged to create dramatic shadows while simultaneously ensuring the viewing angle would be poor for detail. The 200 prisoners were marched out in groups of 20. They'd been given specific instructions. Fall backward on the count, remain motionless for 3 minutes, avoid flinching at the gunfire. Most importantly, they were to trust that the Wehrmacht soldiers loading them onto trucks afterward were part of the deception, not a secondary execution squad. At 7:27 p.m., Seidel gave the first firing command. The rifles cracked in unison, blank rounds with muzzle flash but no bullets. The first 20 prisoners collapsed in reasonably convincing fashion, though 3 fell too early, and one man's theatrical death throes were so dramatic that Hoffman had to suppress inappropriate laughter. Vogel's men rushed forward with stretchers, splattering pig blood across the prisoners' chests as they loaded them into covered trucks. To any observer, it looked like efficient German battlefield medicine, removing bodies before the next group was positioned. The entire process took 93 minutes. By 9:00 p.m., 200 corpses had been transported to the forest burial site. By 9:45 p.m., all 200 living men were descending into the northern mine entrance, carrying the blankets, water containers, and food supplies that Bruckner's team had pre-positioned. By 10:30 p.m., the mine entrance was resealed, camouflaged with snow and deadfall, and utterly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Meanwhile, at the official burial site 3 kilometers away, Vogel's team was interring 30 pig carcasses and 60 chickens wrapped in prisoner uniforms soaked in blood and kerosene. The graves were shallow, properly treated with lime, and marked with simple wooden crosses bearing falsified names. The SS inspection team would find everything exactly as expected. Fresh graves, proper documentation, the lingering smell of execution and burial. They would not find 200 living men breathing stale air 4 levels underground, wondering if they'd just traded one form of death for another. At 11:47 p.m., Reinhardt sat in his office writing the execution report. His hand was steady as he documented the deaths of 200 men who were, at that moment, very much alive. He listed each name, each supposed cause of death, each body's location in the mass grave. The paperwork was perfect. He'd been trained well in Wehrmacht administrative procedure. When he finished, he walked outside into the February darkness. The temperature had dropped to -22 Celsius. Stars spread across the sky like ice crystals. Somewhere in the forest, 200 Soviet prisoners were learning to live in absolute darkness, rationing body heat, wondering if the German professor who spoke beautiful Russian had saved them or merely delayed their death. Reinhardt stood in the cold until his fingers went numb. Then he went back inside to plan the first supply delivery. The SS inspection team arrived at 8:03 a.m. on February 12th. There were 3 officers, an Oberstleutnant named Dietrich Kohl, a Hauptsturmführer whose name Reinhardt never learned, and a civilian analyst from the Reich Security Main Office. They wore the death's head insignia and carried themselves with the particular arrogance of men who believed themselves guardians of racial purity. Reinhardt met them at the camp gate with full military honors. Seidel and Hoffman flanked him, both men maintaining expressionless faces despite the terror Reinhardt knew they felt. If the inspection revealed anything, if the SS decided to exhume even one grave, the entire conspiracy would collapse in minutes. Herr Oberstleutnant, Reinhardt saluted crisply. Welcome to Stalag 319. All execution protocols have been completed per your orders. Kohl returned the salute with a raised arm. Heil Hitler, show me the graves. They drove to the burial site in a Kubelwagen, following the snow-packed road through the forest. Reinhardt maintained a running commentary about camp operations, filling the silence with technical details about prisoner management, security protocols, and logistics challenges. He was deliberately boring, hoping to make the inspection feel routine rather than investigative. The graves were exactly as staged. 35 mounds of fresh earth, properly spaced, marked with crosses. The lime treatment created a sharp chemical smell that discouraged close examination. Cole walked among the graves with his clipboard, checking names against the execution list Reinhardt had submitted. Partisan status confirmed for all deceased? Cole asked. Yes, Herr Obersturmbannführer. All subjects were captured during anti-partisan operations near Vitebsk. All refused to provide intelligence regarding Soviet military positions. All met criteria for summary execution under Field Marshal Keitel's Commissar Order. This was technically accurate. The Commissar Order authorized execution of Soviet political officers and partisans. What Reinhardt didn't mention was that the order was illegal under international law, that most Wehrmacht commanders ignored it when possible, and that the prisoners in question had actually provided extensive intelligence in exchange for promises of humane treatment. Cole tapped his boot against one of the graves. Depth? 1.5 meters, sir. Standard field burial protocol. Cause of death? Firing squad, 12-man detail. Each subject received one fatal volley. Reinhardt handed over the execution logs, which documented precise times, assigned executioners, and bullet counts, all completely fabricated. The civilian analyst spoke for the first time. I'll need to verify several bodies. Random selection. He gestured toward 3 graves. These. Reinhardt's blood went cold, but his face remained calm. Of course, however, I should mention that the lime treatment has accelerated decomposition significantly. The bodies are not presentable. The smell will be severe. I've smelled worse, the analyst replied flatly. Seidel appeared beside Reinhardt carrying 2 shovels. His face was white, but his voice was steady. Shall I begin exhumation, Herr Oberstleutnant? This was the moment. If they started digging, they'd find pig carcasses instead of human bodies. The deception would be exposed. Reinhardt, Hoffmann, Seidel, Vogel, Bruckner, all of them would be shot within the hour. The 200 prisoners underground would be hunted down and executed properly. Reinhardt turned to Cole. With respect, Herr Obersturmbannführer, if we exhume these bodies, we'll need to retreat them with lime and re-enter them properly. That's 6 hours of labor minimum, plus additional lime we don't have in inventory. I'd need to requisition supplies from Vitebsk, which will delay our scheduled troop movements. He paused. Unless the Herr Obersturmbannführer has specific concerns about execution protocol compliance. Cole looked at the graves, then at the paperwork, then at Reinhardt. Your records are comprehensive. I was a university professor, sir. I appreciate documentation. Cole laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. A professor playing soldier. How very German. He turned to the civilian analyst. Your assessment? The analyst studied Reinhardt for a long moment. His eyes were the coldest Reinhardt had ever seen. Flat, calculating, utterly indifferent to human life. The paperwork is exemplary, the analyst said finally. Execution timing is consistent. Grave preparation meets specifications. Lime treatment is properly administered. He glanced at the forest surrounding them. This location is sufficiently remote to prevent civilian discovery. I see no reason for exhumation. Reinhardt didn't breathe. Beside him, Seidel's grip on the shovels tightened until his knuckles went white. Cole nodded. Very well. Mark the inspection as satisfactory. He signed the approval form and handed it to Reinhardt. Heil Hitler, Oberstleutnant. Your efficiency is noted. Heil Hitler, Reinhardt replied. They drove back to the camp in silence. Cole and his team departed within 20 minutes, their staff car disappearing down the road toward Vitebsk. Only after they were completely out of sight did Reinhardt allow himself to lean against the compound fence, his legs suddenly weak. Hoffmann appeared beside him. That was closer than— Don't, Reinhardt interrupted. Don't say it. Don't think about it. We have 200 men underground who need food tonight. The routine Reinhardt established over the following weeks was brutal in its precision. Every night at 2 o'clock a.m., he would leave camp alone, ostensibly on security patrol. He'd drive a supply truck to the hidden mine entrance, unload food, water, medical supplies, and waste containers, then return before dawn. The prisoners had organized themselves underground with impressive discipline. Komarov had established a command structure, rationing system, and even a schedule of organized activities to prevent psychological breakdown in the perpetual darkness. But the strain was showing on everyone. The prisoners were developing vitamin deficiencies from lack of sunlight. Several had pneumonia from the damp underground air. They were rationing water so strictly that dehydration was becoming serious. And the psychological toll of living in complete darkness, not knowing if rescue would ever come, was creating tensions that occasionally erupted into violence. Above ground, Reinhardt was also fracturing. He slept 3 hours per night. He'd lost 14 kilograms. His hands shook constantly, and he'd begun drinking schnapps to steady his nerves before the nightly supply runs. Hoffman and Seidel covered for him during daytime operations, but the camp was starting to notice their commander's deterioration. On March 3rd, a new problem emerged. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber arrived from Army Group Center headquarters to conduct a surprise inspection of camp operations. Weber was a by-the-book officer with political connections in Berlin, exactly the kind of man who would notice irregularities. Herr Oberstleutnant, Weber announced at their first meeting, I'm here to evaluate defensive readiness and supply management. I'll need complete access to all facilities, all records, and all personnel. Of course, Reinhardt replied smoothly. Though I should mention we've had significant partisan activity in the surrounding forest. Nighttime patrols are restricted for security reasons. I'll need to observe a night patrol. That's inadvisable, Hauptmann. The woods are... I'll observe tonight's patrol, Weber interrupted. 2:00 a.m. I'll accompany you personally. Reinhardt felt the trap closing. If Weber accompanied the supply run, he'd discover everything. If Reinhardt refused, Weber would become suspicious and investigate independently. Either way, the 200 men underground were in immediate danger. That afternoon, Reinhardt gathered his inner circle one final time. They met in the camp's ammunition bunker, the only location they were certain wasn't monitored. We have a decision to make, Reinhardt said without preamble. Weber will discover the prisoners tonight unless we prevent it. Our options are limited and all bad. We could kill him, Vogel said quietly. Stage an accident. Partisan ambush. Murder a Wehrmacht officer? Hoffman shook his head. That crosses a line even I won't cross. We crossed the line weeks ago, Seidel pointed out. We're already traitors. What's one more crime? It's different, Reinhardt said firmly. Weber is doing his job. He's not SS. He's not ordering executions. He's just a thorough officer who happens to be in the wrong place. I won't kill a man for being competent. Then what? Bruckner asked. Reinhardt was silent for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the bunker door, looking out at the compound where soldiers were preparing for evening meal. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. I tell him the truth. That's insane, 3 voices said simultaneously. Perhaps, but consider, Weber is a career officer. He's seen the war turning. He knows what's coming. He might be convinced that covering up an execution is better than exposing a humanitarian action that could complicate his own career. If we approach this as fellow officers protecting each other from political complications, he might see the logic. And if he doesn't, Hoffman asked, then he'll report us, we'll be arrested, and the prisoners will be executed properly. But at least we'll have tried without adding murder to our list of sins. That night, Reinhardt met Weber in his office at 1:45 a.m. The captain arrived precisely on time, dressed in full winter combat gear, ready for patrol. He found Reinhardt sitting at his desk with a bottle of schnapps and 2 glasses. Hauptmann Schwarz, Reinhardt said, before we begin tonight's patrol, there's something you should know, something that will affect your inspection report significantly. I'm listening, Weber replied cautiously. You're going to discover that I've falsified execution records, hidden enemy prisoners, and committed treason against the Reich. I'm telling you this now because if you discover it independently, you'll have no context for why a loyal Wehrmacht officer would do something so catastrophically illegal. Weber's hand moved to his sidearm. Reinhardt made no defensive move. I'm not armed, Reinhardt said. I'm not going to resist. I'm simply going to explain what happened, and then you're going to make a decision about what kind of officer you want to be. For the next hour, Reinhardt explained everything. The execution order, the fake deaths, the underground prisoners, the nightly supply runs, the SS inspection he'd fooled, the mathematical certainty that Army Group Center would collapse, and Soviet forces would overrun the camp within weeks. Weber listened without interrupting. When Reinhardt finished, he poured himself a schnapps, drank it in one swallow, and poured another. "You're insane," Weber said finally. "Probably. If I report this, you'll be doing your duty. I won't blame you." Weber stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark compound. When he turned back, his face was impossible to read. "My brother was killed at Stalingrad," Weber said quietly. "He was a doctor, a non-combatant, who tried to save lives even when the situation was hopeless. His last letter said he was ashamed of what we'd become, that the war had turned us into something unrecognizable." He paused. "I didn't understand what he meant until tonight." "So what will you do?" Reinhardt asked. Weber was silent for a very long time. Then he picked up the schnapps bottle, filled both glasses, and handed one to Reinhardt. "I'm going to include in my inspection report that Stalag 319 maintains exemplary records, professional conduct, and proper execution of all lawful orders. I'm going to note that prisoner management protocols are beyond reproach, and I'm going to recommend that Oberstleutnant Reinhardt receive commendation for administrative excellence under difficult circumstances." He drank his schnapps and set the glass down firmly. "I'm also going to develop sudden illness that requires me to return to headquarters immediately before I observe any nighttime operations that might complicate my report. And in approximately 6 weeks, when Soviet forces overrun this position, I'm going to be far enough west that no one will ask me difficult questions about what I did or didn't see at Stalag 319. Reinhardt felt something crack inside his chest, relief so powerful it was almost painful. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me," Weber replied. "I'm not being noble. I'm being a coward who doesn't want to explain to his brother's ghost why I executed a man for refusing to become a murderer. We're all damned, Oberstleutnant. Some of us are just choosing which particular circle of hell will occupy." Weber left at dawn, filing his glowing report and disappearing back toward Army Group Center headquarters. Reinhardt never saw him again, though he learned later that Weber survived the war, returned to Munich, and became a priest. By late March, Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The front was collapsing exactly as Reinhardt had predicted. Army Group Center was in full retreat, and orders came through regular channels. All Wehrmacht units in the Vitebsk sector were to withdraw westward by April 1st. Stalag 319 was to be evacuated, all records destroyed, all prisoners either transferred or liquidated per field commander discretion. Reinhardt now faced his original impossible choice: retreat and leave 200 men buried alive, or expose everything. On March 28th, he made his decision. At 6:00 a.m., he assembled every German soldier in Stalag 319, 73 men total, in the compound's main hall. He stood on a platform where announcements were typically made, looking at faces ranging from 18 to 56, most of them exhausted, all of them knowing the camp would soon be abandoned. "Gentlemen," Reinhardt began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 years commanding this facility, "I'm about to tell you something that will result in my court-martial and probable execution. I'm telling you anyway because you deserve to know what you have been part of, and because some of you will have to make choices in the next 72 hours. He told them everything. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of distant artillery growing closer. When he finished, Obergefreiter Paul Richter, a 19-year-old from Stuttgart who'd been at the camp for 8 months, raised his hand like he was still in school. "Sir, are you saying there are 200 Russians living in the mines right now? That they've been there for 6 weeks?" "Yes." "And we're going to just leave them there when we evacuate?" "No," Reinhardt said quietly. "I'm going to open the mine entrance, provide them with supplies, maps, and information about Soviet positions. Then I'm going to walk to the nearest Red Army unit and surrender. I'll take full responsibility. The rest of you will retreat with the Wehrmacht as ordered. None of you knew about this until today. That's my story, and I'll maintain it under any interrogation." Lieutenant Hoffman stood. "Permission to speak, Herr Oberstleutnant?" "Granted." "That's the stupidest plan I've ever heard. If you surrender to the Soviets, they'll shoot you immediately. They're not going to believe a Wehrmacht officer saved 200 of their men. They'll think it's a trick." "He's right," Seidel added. "You need proof. Witnesses. Someone the Soviets will believe." Komarov solved the problem by walking into the compound hall himself. The appearance of a Soviet senior sergeant in full partisan uniform created instant chaos. Rifles swung toward him from every direction. Reinhardt shouted for order, but it was Komarov's voice, speaking perfect German, that cut through the confusion. "I am Senior Sergeant Dmitry Komarov, commander of the 14th Partisan Brigade. I have been living underground in the mines with 199 of my men for 43 days. Oberstleutnant Reinhardt saved our lives when he could have executed us. If any German soldier harms him, my men will fight their way out of those mines and kill every one of you before you can retreat. If you allow him to surrender honorably, we guarantee safe passage for all Wehrmacht personnel during evacuation." The hall erupted in arguments. Some soldiers wanted to shoot Komarov immediately. Others were processing the revelation that they'd been working above 200 enemy soldiers for weeks. A few were laughing at the absurdity of the situation. Reinhardt raised his hand for silence. When he got it, he addressed the partisan commander directly, still speaking German. "Senior Sergeant, how did you get into the compound?" "The eastern ventilation shaft. Your Lieutenant Bruckner showed me where it was last week, in case of emergency. I've been monitoring your morning assemblies for days, waiting for the right moment to reveal ourselves." Komarov turned to address the German soldiers. "My men and I were dead. Your commander gave us life. In Russian military tradition, that creates a debt of honor. We will honor it." What happened next was perhaps the strangest negotiation of the Eastern Front. For 6 hours, German Wehrmacht soldiers and Soviet partisans sat together in the Stalag 319 mess hall, working out the logistics of mutual survival. Maps were spread across tables where, weeks earlier, execution orders had been signed. Komarov's men emerged from the mines in small groups, blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen in 6 weeks, while German soldiers watched with rifles lowered but ready. The agreement was simple. The Germans would provide the Soviets with food, medical supplies, and current intelligence about Wehrmacht retreat routes. The Soviets would allow the Germans to evacuate westward without harassment. Reinhardt would accompany the partisans as their prisoner, carrying documentation of everything that had happened, signed by both German and Soviet witnesses. On March 31st, 1944, at 4:17 a.m., the evacuation began. 73 German soldiers loaded trucks and began their retreat toward Army Group Center's collapsing lines. 200 Soviet partisans, carrying German medical supplies and wearing a mixture of Wehrmacht and Red Army equipment, began their march toward Soviet positions 15 kilometers east. Reinhardt stood between the two groups, watching his soldiers disappear west, while Komarov's men formed ranks to the east. He'd exchanged his Wehrmacht uniform for civilian clothes. Komarov had insisted, saying Soviet soldiers would shoot a German officer on sight regardless of circumstance. "Ready, Professor?" Komarov asked in Russian. Reinhardt nodded. They began walking. They reached Soviet lines on April 2nd. The Red Army unit that captured them, elements of the 5th Guards Tank Army, immediately arrested Reinhardt and separated him from the partisans. For 3 days, he was interrogated by submerged counterintelligence officers who were convinced he was either a spy, a saboteur, or insane. The story was too impossible to believe. Then Komarov's testimony reached front headquarters. Then the other 199 partisans confirmed every detail. Then Soviet intelligence recovered German execution records from abandoned Stalag 319 that perfectly matched Reinhardt's account, complete with forged death certificates and SS inspection approvals. The Soviet command faced an unprecedented situation. A German officer who had committed treason against the Reich to save Soviet lives, documented with evidence that satisfied even paranoid SMERSH investigators. On April 19, 1944, Reinhardt was transferred to a special NKVD facility near Moscow. He spent the remainder of the war in a cell that was technically imprisonment but felt more like protective custody. He was interrogated hundreds of times, not brutally but exhaustively, as Soviet intelligence tried to understand his motivations and determine if there were other Wehrmacht officers who might be persuaded to similar acts. The war ended. The tribunals began. The Soviet Union wanted to use Reinhardt as propaganda, proof that even Germans could choose humanity over Nazism. But the evidence was too perfect, too documented, too obviously exceptional. Using him as an example would raise uncomfortable questions about why he was an exception, why so few others had made similar choices. The Western Allies preparing for Nuremberg reviewed his case and found it equally problematic. He'd violated lawful orders, falsified military records, and hidden enemy combatants, technically crimes even if committed for humanitarian reasons. Making him a hero would complicate their prosecution of Wehrmacht officers who claimed they were just following orders. The Germans, both East and West, didn't know what to do with him at all. He was held in Soviet custody until 1952, then quietly released and allowed to return to West Germany. No trial was ever held, no official judgment was ever rendered. The file on Oberstleutnant Klaus Reinhardt was marked classified, indefinite, and buried in archives in Moscow, Washington, and Bonn. He lived the rest of his life in a small apartment in Freiburg, working as a translator for academic journals. He never spoke publicly about Stalag 319. The 200 men he saved had scattered across the Soviet Union after the war. Some became officials in the communist government, others disappeared into the vast Russian interior. A few were purged in Stalin's post-war paranoia for having been captured at all. Dmitry Komarov survived the purges, became a school teacher in Smolensk, and wrote a memoir in 1967 that detailed everything. The Soviet government refused to publish it. Komarov's manuscript circulated as samizdat, forbidden literature copied by hand, and passed secretly among readers who wanted to know uncomfortable truths. In 1989, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Komarov's memoir was finally published in Moscow. Journalists tracked down Klaus Reinhardt in Freiburg. He was 83 years old, living alone, nearly blind. They asked him why he'd done it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It seemed like the only choice that would let me remain human. I was probably wrong. I certainly wasn't heroic. I was just a man who couldn't murder 200 people, so I found another way." "Do you have regrets?" He was quiet for a long time. "I regret that it was exceptional. It should have been normal. That's the real crime, that refusing to commit murder was considered treason, and committing murder was considered duty. We built a system where humanity became the crime." Reinhardt died in 1991, 2 months after the Soviet Union dissolved. He left no family, no estate, no legacy except a story that neither side wanted to acknowledge because it complicated their narratives about the war. In 2003, Russian and German historians jointly published the complete documentation of the Stalag 319 operation, including testimony from 47 survivors, Wehrmacht records, Soviet intelligence files, and SS inspection reports. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The story had been true all along. In 2008, a memorial was erected near the former Stalag 319 site, now in independent Belarus. It lists 200 names, the Soviet partisans who were executed on February 11, 1944, and somehow walked away alive. At the bottom is a single German name, Klaus Reinhardt, who proved that even in hell, some men remember how to be human. The graves that breathed became the graves that spoke, testimony that in the darkest chapter of human history, individual conscience could still trump systemic evil. Not often enough, not nearly enough, but sometimes, in small ways, by ordinary men who simply refused to become what the war demanded. Reinhardt saved 200 lives by risking one. The mathematics seems simple, but the moral calculus was infinitely complex, and history has never decided whether he was a hero or a traitor. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps that's the only honest answer. Soldiers and Soviet partisans sat together in the Stalag 319 mess hall, working out the logistics of mutual survival. Maps were spread across tables where, weeks earlier, execution orders had been signed. Komarov's men emerged from the mines in small groups, blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen in 6 weeks, while German soldiers watched with rifles lowered but ready. The agreement was simple. The Germans would provide the Soviets with food, medical supplies, and current intelligence about Wehrmacht retreat routes. The Soviets would allow the Germans to evacuate westward without harassment. Reinhardt would accompany the partisans as their prisoner, carrying documentation of everything that had happened, signed by both German and Soviet witnesses. On March 31, 1944, at 4:17 a.m., the evacuation began. 73 German soldiers loaded trucks and began their retreat toward Army Group Center's collapsing lines. 200 Soviet partisans, carrying German medical supplies and wearing a mixture of Wehrmacht and Red Army equipment, began their march toward Soviet positions 15 kilometers east. Reinhardt stood between the two groups, watching his soldiers disappear west while Komarov's men formed ranks to the east. He'd exchanged his Wehrmacht uniform for civilian clothes. Komarov had insisted, saying Soviet soldiers would shoot a German officer on sight regardless of circumstance. "Ready, Professor?" Komarov asked in Russian. Reinhardt nodded. They began walking. They reached Soviet lines on April 2nd. The Red Army unit that captured them, elements of the 5th Guards Tank Army, immediately arrested Reinhardt and separated him from the partisans. For 3 days, he was interrogated by submerged counterintelligence officers who were convinced he was either a spy, a saboteur, or insane. The story was too impossible to believe. Then Komarov's testimony reached front headquarters. Then the other 199 partisans confirmed every detail. Then Soviet intelligence recovered German execution records from abandoned Stalag 319 that perfectly matched Reinhardt's account, complete with forged death certificates and SS inspection approvals. The Soviet command faced an unprecedented situation. A German officer who had committed treason against the Reich to save Soviet lives, documented with evidence that satisfied even paranoid Smersh investigators. On April 19, 1944, Reinhardt was transferred to a special NKVD facility near Moscow. He spent the remainder of the war in a cell that was technically imprisonment but felt more like protective custody. He was interrogated hundreds of times, not brutally but exhaustively, as Soviet intelligence tried to understand his motivations and determine if there were other Wehrmacht officers who might be persuaded to similar acts. The war ended. The tribunals began. The Soviet Union wanted to use Reinhardt as propaganda, proof that even Germans could choose humanity over Nazism. But the evidence was too perfect, too documented, too obviously exceptional. Using him as an example would raise uncomfortable questions about why he was an exception, why so few others had made similar choices. The Western allies, preparing for Nuremberg, reviewed his case and found it equally problematic. He'd violated lawful orders, falsified military records, and hidden enemy combatants, technically crimes even if committed for humanitarian reasons. Making him a hero would complicate their prosecution of Wehrmacht officers who claimed they were just following orders. The Germans, both East and West, didn't know what to do with him at all. He was held in Soviet custody until 1952, then quietly released and allowed to return to West Germany. No trial was ever held. No official judgment was ever rendered. The file on Oberstleutnant Klaus Reinhardt was marked classified indefinite and buried in archives in Moscow, Washington, and Bonn. He lived the rest of his life in a small apartment in Freiburg, working as a translator for academic journals. He never spoke publicly about Stalag 319. The 200 men he saved had scattered across the Soviet Union after the war. Some became officials in the communist government. Others disappeared into the vast Russian interior. A few were purged in Stalin's post-war paranoia for having been captured at all. Dmitry Komarov survived the purges, became a school teacher in Smolensk, and wrote a memoir in 1967 that detailed everything. The Soviet government refused to publish it. Komarov's manuscript circulated as samizdat, forbidden literature copied by hand and passed secretly among readers who wanted to know uncomfortable truths. In 1980, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Komarov's memoir was finally published in Moscow. Journalists tracked down Klaus Reinhardt in Freiburg. He was 83 years old, living alone, nearly blind. They asked him why he'd done it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It seemed like the only choice that would let me remain human. I was probably wrong. I certainly wasn't heroic. I was just a man who couldn't murder 200 people. So I found another way." "Do you have regrets?" He was quiet for a long time. "I regret that it was exceptional. It should have been normal. That's the real crime. That refusing to commit murder was considered treason, and committing murder was considered duty. We built a system where humanity became the crime." Reinhardt died in 1991, 2 months after the Soviet Union dissolved. He left no family, no estate, no legacy except a story that neither side wanted to acknowledge because it complicated their narratives about the war. In 2003, Russian and German historians jointly published the complete documentation of the Stalag 319 operation, including testimony from 47 survivors, Wehrmacht records, Soviet intelligence files, and SS inspection reports. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The story had been true all along. In 2008, a memorial was erected near the former Stalag 319 site, now in independent Belarus. It lists 200 names, the Soviet partisans who were executed on February 11, 1944, and somehow walked away alive. At the bottom is a single German name, Klaus Reinhardt, who proved that even in hell, some men remember how to be human. The graves that breathed became the graves that spoke. Testimony that in the darkest chapter of human history, individual conscience could still trump systemic evil. Not often enough, not nearly enough, but sometimes in small ways, by ordinary men who simply refused to become what the war demanded. Reinhardt saved 200 lives by risking one. The mathematics seemed simple, but the moral calculus was infinitely complex.